Holocaust was a horrific genocide that forever changed the world. Not only did it reveal the extent of evil that humanity could manifest, but it also showed how cognitive dissonance can be dangerous to a society, turning a blind eye to evil. Well, after the Nazis were defeated, there was the question of what to do with the brains behind Hitler's war machine. So there were hundreds of scientific minds behind the Third Reich, spanning from nuclear physicists to social scientists, many of which were complicit in horrific war crimes, and others had even stood trial at Nuremberg. But instead of holding these war criminals accountable for their Nazi complicity, many of them were brought to the U.S., where they and their families were provided safe harbor as part of a decades-long covert U.S. intelligence program called Operation Paperclip. Well, earlier I was joined by Christopher Simpson, professor of communications at American University and author of Blowback, the first full account of America's recruitment of Nazis. I first asked Christopher why the U.S. would even implement such a horrific program in the first place.
Several different factors were involved. Number one is the emergence of the Cold War. And there was a relationship, as far as the Cold War is concerned, in which recruitment of Nazis or tolerance of former Nazis in power in Germany added to the then Soviet Union's worries about, well, what were the post-war intentions of the Western Allies, and some of those questions went back to the wartime period and even earlier. All right, so then that again spurred more Cold War tensions, and so it grew that way. Meanwhile, the Soviets were also recruiting Nazi criminals, and there's a track record of that can be clearly established. So you had a open market, if you will, in which on the one hand, there were prosecutions of Nazis. On the other hand, there was recruiting of Nazis and protection of them in a variety of different ways by the Western Allies as well as by the Soviets. You see today some of the same phenomena in terms of people who are responsible for very serious crimes, Southeast Asia, other parts of the world, again, will be picked up for intelligence purposes or even for commercial gain.
And some of these people weren't just in the Nazi Party. I mean, they were at the Nuremberg trials for crimes against humanity, war crimes. I mean, these people were guilty of a lot. What's your response? You briefly mentioned that the Soviets were also recruiting Nazis as well. That's kind of the common response that we hear, is that if we didn't recruit them, the Soviets would have taken them all.
The claim on the part of the Western Allies that the Soviets would recruit them all was false. The major initiative to recruit Nazi criminals came from the Western Allies. That said, the Soviets, too, were engaged in selection of particular people that they thought would be beneficial to them, mainly for intelligence-type purposes, intelligence and propaganda and so on. Once you start looking at this situation, it gets more complicated than it looks on the surface. Because, for example, suppose somebody who was a German, who did participate in crimes against humanity, who was guilty, then changes his or her stripes during the war or after the war. Well, what does that mean? Well, in my personal opinion, in my view, it means that they still have to be brought to justice for crimes that they did in fact commit, but that their post-war attitudes are part of the complicated judgment that society makes out against people who commit very, very serious crimes.
And what was the long-term effect on American intelligence of implementing this program here?
There was a very significant effect on U.S. intelligence operations and, to some degree, on U.S. appraisals of what was going on in Europe. Let me say that a different way. If you have Nazi intelligence officials who have devoted large parts of their life to German intelligence and then later to Hitler-style Nazi intelligence, they have a particular point of view as to how they see the world. And when the United States or England relies largely on such people for their information about those who they say are the enemy, which in this context are the Soviets, well, you get a highly warped picture about what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic. Particularly in the early Cold War, these people had significant effects on American intelligence. We were dependent, or the Americans were dependent upon what they had to say was going on in Germany at that time. Meanwhile, that type of thing feeds on itself in this way, is that, for example, intelligence agencies don't just process intelligence. They don't just kind of sit behind desks and act as scholars. No, these are action agencies. So they do covert operations, they do propaganda, they do different forms of subversion and attack, sabotage against whoever the enemy of the moment is. So that the former Nazis, at least some of them, had an incentive to paint as dark a picture of the Soviets as possibly could be painted in order to finance their own organizations. There was a very powerful drift towards war.
Chris, you mentioned that it went beyond physical scientists. I mean, we're talking about social scientists.
Sure.
What do you say to people, I mean, in the broader sense that this country and this government has kind of adopted the Nazi propaganda model? What Goebbels was doing has been implemented here in just a much more insidious way. I mean, do you see any correlation there?
Well, I think it's true that everybody in the mass media of every nationality has learned some lessons from Goebbels, frankly. I think that that's true, and that all of the major powers have very large-scale propaganda operations. So the problem is not abstract. The problem is literally with us. It's with us on the set right now, and it's with us in the most reputable media sort of situations where news media, this is my belief anyway, tends to be highly ideological. Now that doesn't mean that everybody has the same ideology. It doesn't mean that everybody agrees with whatever the official ideology is. What I mean is that people shape what they do in the media based on what they believe.
Every year, it seems like there's another movie coming out about Nazi Germany, about the Holocaust. Now, Monuments Men is out, which talks about saving the artwork from World War II. To what extent do you think Hollywood plays a role in the historical revisionism, kind of leaving out all, everything about Operation Paperclip, everything that happened afterward, and also just corporate influence in aiding and abetting the Holocaust?
I think that's a complicated question. Basically, there is a polite version of the Holocaust which explains what took place in very simplistic terms. And the extent to which the Holocaust was an organic product of German society as it existed at that time. Meanwhile, there is also, in my view, a very serious problem in which some victims are recognized while others are denied. I'll give you just one example. People understand the Holocaust as being the gas ovens, right? Terrible crime. Many, many people died in the gas ovens. The stories of the gas ovens are not made up. They are facts, history. That said, most of the Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust, they were worked to death. They were shot with guns. They were destroyed they were starved to death. They were destroyed in other ways. So what that means is, here in Western culture, we get this idea of, oh, Holocaust equals gas ovens. But these other means of destroying whole societies, they're somehow not recognized as actually being crimes.
Christopher Simpson, Professor of Communications, American University. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.